Libretti, Recits, Arias, Ensembles, Overtures. That's right, today we're breaking it down and finding out what an opera is made of. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, and that's Mozart. When we get to see an opera, we get to experience this beautiful culmination of lots of different art forms, from the theatrical side with costumes, set design, stage direction, etc., and then the musical side with the orchestra and, of course, the singing. But when we take a step back and actually look at the composition, we see that there are a lot of textual and musical elements that composers consistently draw on in order to bring stories to life, to keep a plot moving forward, and really allow us to see the full expression of these characters and their complexities. The first element that a composer is going to use to create an opera, which is actually the element that sort of sets the entire structure for the show, is the libretto, or as we Americans like to call it, libretto. The libretto is basically the script. And in the earliest days of opera, it was always in a poetic form, and that's because, as we discussed in our What is Art Song video, poetic form most naturally lends itself to the musical structure. Just like in today's musical theater, where we're getting a lot of shows that come up that are based on stories that are really familiar to us, even the oldest opera libretti were actually based on stories that everyone knew. So in the early days of Baroque opera, there would be a lot of libretti that revolved around Greek mythology or historical characters up to that point. For example, Handel's Giulio Cesare, which tells the story of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. As time went on, of course, we get more and more stories and more sources. So, for example, Mozart set an opera that was based on a play by Beaumarchais, and Gounod's Faust is based on Goethe's Faust, and so on and so forth, so that now in today's world we actually have operas such as Tom Cipulo's Glory Denied, which is based on a book by the same title that's about America's longest held POW. So as time has gone on, and as we've had more stories and more historical experiences, one of the ways that opera is staying relevant is by choosing libretti that are actually relevant to what we are experiencing in our own lives today. And just like in musical theater, where you had Rodgers and Hammerstein, and you have all of these great composer-songwriter duos, opera has great composer-librettist duos. So, for example, Mozart teamed up with Lorenzo da Ponte, and together they wrote 3 of Mozart's most famous operas: Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. And they worked so well together because they had a common purpose. At this point in music history, like I said, a lot of operas were about Greek mythology, or these really stock character archetypes. And Da Ponte and Mozart really wanted to show more complex characters. They wanted to make the characters more human. And one of the beautiful ways that they did that actually was through humor. They put in a lot more funny moments, and they made these characters so complex. And that's why the 3 operas that they wrote together are so special and really are some of Mozart's greatest pieces. Of course, there were other librettists like Pietro Metastasio, who was very famous in his own right. And so all kinds of composers would set his libretti, from Handel to Bach and even Mozart. And then, of course, there were the composers that chose to be their own librettist, like Wagner, who, let's face it, might have had some control issues. So the next element, which is not necessarily what the composer would start with musically in terms of composing the opera, but it's certainly what we experience first as an audience, is the overture. If you're familiar with that term from musical theater, a lot of us imagine this piece of music that starts off the show and will most likely sort of preview the musical themes that we're going to hear throughout the rest of the show. In opera, that's certainly something that composers can and often do, but it's actually not the rule. The earliest references to this sort of pre-show music date all the way back to the beginnings of opera, but they were called prologues, which if we look at ancient Greek theater, often the play would start with a prologue, whether that was spoken through a character or through a chorus, and it would sort of set up the show. And so in opera now we have a musical prologue. The term overture came into practice with a French composer by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lully. And we should say his name again because it's fun. Jean-Baptiste Lully. And he started writing this more structured opening. And so in the French style, the Overture starts with a very slow section and then moves into a faster section that becomes more and more dance-like. Of course, the Italians also had to have their take on the Overture, and their structure for the overture was to start with a fast section, then a very slow section, followed by another fast section. And eventually, they started to sort of separate the overture from the opera, and they would perform these overtures in more of a concert setting. And that's actually the beginnings of the symphonic form. So the source of the symphony is actually opera overtures. So a composer actually has quite a lot of freedom when it comes to writing an overture. They can follow either the French or the Italian form. It can have no form. It can just be what we call through composed. It can sample musical material that we'll hear in the opera, or it can be completely separate musical material. But of course, the purpose of the overture is to let the audience know that the show is about to start. Stop talking, settle down, unwrap all your little butter toffee candies, sit back, relax, and get ready, because the show's about to start.